The first sound I heard that morning wasn't my alarm. It was the groan of hydraulics, the metallic shriek of a bucket scraping against rock. I looked at the clock on my nightstand. 6:42 a.m. The sun was just beginning to burn the mist off the surface of the reservoir that sat on the hill behind my property. I pulled on a robe, walked to the kitchen, and started the coffee maker, the familiar gurgle, a calming counterpoint to the industrial noise outside. With a warm mug in my hands, I stepped onto my back porch. There, on the edge of my land, where the manicured green of my lawn met the wild scrub of the hillside, was a small, yellow excavator. It was methodically tearing up the earth, digging a shallow trench right through a line of survey stakes I had paid to have installed 3 weeks prior. And standing beside it, arms crossed, wearing a canary yellow tracksuit that seemed to vibrate with self-importance, was Carol. Carol was the president of the Homeowners Association for the pristine, cookie-cutter development that lay in the valley just below my property. She held a clipboard like a scepter and was directing the excavator operator with sharp, imperious gestures. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It was a dark roast, bitter and strong, the way I liked it. I watched for another full minute as the machine chewed up my land, its bucket tossing aside soil and the splintered remains of my wooden survey markers. She hadn't seen me yet. She was too absorbed in her performance of authority. I walked down the gentle slope of my lawn, my slippers damp with dew. I didn't hurry. When I was about 20 feet away, she finally noticed me. A triumphant, predatory smile spread across her face. "Good morning," she chirped, her voice several octaves too high for the early hour. "Finally decided to join us? We're just reclaiming the community access path. It's been on the development plans for years. You can't just block it off." I stopped a few feet from the fresh scar in the earth. I didn't say anything. I just looked at the trench, then at her, then back at the trench. I took another sip of coffee. My silence seemed to unnerve her more than any argument would have. "Well?" she demanded, her smile tightening. "Don't you have anything to say? Your little stakes are gone. This is HOA property, and we are restoring access for the residents. You've been illegally obstructing it." I raised my phone, which had been in my robe pocket, and began recording. I didn't hide it. I held it up in a way that was obvious, the red dot on the screen glowing faintly in the morning light. Her eyes narrowed. "Are you recording me?" she snapped. I still didn't speak. I just panned the phone's camera from her face to the excavator, to the operator who was now looking uncomfortable, and then along the length of the muddy trench that ran directly through my property. Her face flushed a blotchy red. The mask of cheerful community leadership evaporated. "You can record all you want, Mr. Henderson. It won't change a thing. I have the full authority of the board. This path is being cleared. If you interfere, I will have you arrested for trespassing on our common area. We will place a lien on your house for the cost of the machinery and for every fine you've ignored. You'll be buried in legal fees before you can even find a lawyer." She took a deep, theatrical breath, puffing out her chest. "I am Carol Jennings, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, and I am ordering this work to be completed." I lowered the phone and finally spoke. My voice was quiet, devoid of emotion. "My name is not Henderson. That's the gentleman who lives 2 houses down from the HOA entrance." She scoffed. "I don't care what your name is. You live here. You're the one causing all the problems." I took one last sip of my coffee, emptying the mug. I looked at the excavator, then at the deep gash it had carved into the land I owned outright. I looked at the reservoir glittering on the hill behind it, the source of all the water for the 150 homes in her perfect little valley. And then I looked back at her, a woman so confident in her petty power, so utterly incurious about the world beyond her own self-importance. She had no idea. She had no idea who I was, what I did for 40 years, or what I had purchased 6 months ago. She had no idea that the piece of paper she was waving around, the so-called development plan, was a 10th-generation photocopy of a marketing brochure, not a legal document. She had no idea that the certified letter I had sent her 3 weeks ago, the one she had returned unopened, contained a notarized copy of my deed and a surveyor's plat that established my property line a full 50 yards downslope from where her machine was currently digging. She had no idea that her entire community, every verdant lawn, every sparkling swimming pool, every shower and every faucet depended entirely on a private water system whose rights were not attached to the HOA, but to the parcel of land she was so gleefully desecrating. She had just declared war on the man who owned her water. But before I tell you what I did next, I should probably explain how I got there. My name is Arthur Vance. For 42 years, I was a civil engineer, specializing in water resource management. My job, in its simplest form, was to understand, plan, and execute the movement of water on a massive scale. I designed aqueducts, managed municipal water grids, and spent the better part of a decade negotiating labyrinthine water rights agreements in the arid West. I lived a life governed by contracts, surveys, deeds, and the immutable laws of physics. My wife Eleanor used to joke that I could find the fine print on a grain of sand. She was the artist, the one who saw the world in color and emotion. I was the one who saw it in blueprints and legal descriptions. We balanced each other. When Eleanor passed away 2 years ago, the color bled out of my world. The large house we had shared felt cavernous and silent. My work, once a source of deep satisfaction, became a collection of tasks. The order and logic that had defined my life suddenly felt hollow. So, I retired. I sold the house, put my affairs in meticulous order, and looked for a place where the world would be quiet. I found it on a listing for an odd-shaped, 5-acre parcel on a hillside, overlooking a newer development called Whispering Pines. The house was modest, built in the 70s, but it was solid. What sold me wasn't the house. It was the land. It was the last remaining parcel from an old farm that had been sold off to a developer 20 years prior. Crucially, my parcel included the old farm's reservoir and the dam that held it in place. The developer had built his 150 homes in the valley below, but for reasons I would later discover were purely financial, he had never formally acquired the reservoir itself or its associated water rights. He had simply connected the development's private water system to the reservoir's outflow, operating under a handshake agreement with the old farmer. When the farmer died, the agreement died with him, and the land, reservoir, and all went to his heirs, who had no interest in it and let it sit for years. I did my due diligence, of course. It's second nature. I spent a week at the county records office. Before I even made an offer, I pulled the original subdivision plats, the tax maps, the deeds. I traced the chain of title back to the original land grant in the 1880s. The documents were clear. The 5-acre parcel, designated Parcel A, was a separate and distinct entity. It was not, and had never been, part of the Whispering Pines HOA. The sale included not just the land and the reservoir, but explicitly the appurtenant riparian rights, a legal term that essentially means the rights to use the water. On paper, it was a fortress, a quiet, defensible space. It was perfect. I moved in and enjoyed the solitude. I read books. I took walks around the reservoir. I watched the hawks circle overhead. I had minimal contact with the HOA below. I wasn't a member, so their rules didn't apply to me. Or so I thought. My first introduction to Carol Jennings was a notice slipped into my mailbox. It was printed on thick cream-colored paper with the Whispering Pines logo embossed in gold foil. It informed me that my mailbox, a standard-issue black metal box, was not in compliance with Guideline 7.4b, which required all mailboxes visible from the community to be painted Forest Glen Green. It included a Pantone color swatch and a warning that a fine of $50 per day would be assessed until the violation was corrected. I read it, chuckled, and threw it in the recycling bin. My property was not part of the HOA. Her rules were as relevant to me as the bylaws of a garden club in another state. A week later, another notice arrived, this one with a bill for $350. I ignored that one too. This was the beginning of my file. I didn't create it consciously at first. It was just a habit. I am a man who keeps receipts. When the third notice arrived, this one via certified mail, I signed for it, opened it, and placed it in a simple manila folder along with the first two. The fines had now reached over $1,000. The letter was filled with threatening language about liens and legal action. It was signed with a flamboyant, looping signature by Carol Jennings, president. Over the next few months, I observed her. From my hillside perch, I had a panoramic view of her kingdom. I saw her striding down the street with her clipboard, pointing out violations. A garden gnome that was 2 inches too tall. A basketball hoop left out after dusk. A car parked on the street for more than the allotted 4 hours. I spoke to a few of the residents when I went to the grocery store. They spoke of her in hushed, fearful tones. She had risen to power on a platform of protecting our property values, and had quickly turned the HOA into her personal fiefdom. She ruled by intimidation and public shaming at the monthly meetings. Most residents found it easier to just pay the fines and repaint their mailboxes than to fight her. They were families with jobs and children. They didn't have the time or the energy for a war of attrition. I, on the other hand, had nothing but time. The folder grew thicker. I received a notice that the unkempt nature of the hillside, the part of my property that wasn't lawn, was a fire hazard and violated community aesthetic standards. Another fine. I received a demand that I remove a dead pine tree, even though it was 100 yards from any HOA property. More fines. I never responded. I just filed the notices. On paper, I was an absentee scofflaw, racking up thousands of dollars in debt to an organization I didn't belong to. In reality, I was building a case file of harassment by a private entity against a non-member. Every notice she sent was another exhibit. The conflict over the community access path began about a month before the excavator incident. She claimed that a historical path used by the old farmer to access the lower fields was a designated HOA common area. It was a complete fabrication. It was not mentioned in any of the deeds or plats. It was simply a route the developer's surveyors had used during construction 20 years ago. Some residents had occasionally used it as a shortcut to the hillside for hiking. I didn't mind. I valued my privacy, but I wasn't unreasonable. Then a notice arrived. It stated that I had to clear a 10-foot wide swath along this path, and that my failure to maintain this community asset would result in the HOA hiring a contractor to do it at my expense. This was a new level of escalation. She wasn't just inventing rules for me anymore. She was inventing property rights for herself. This is when I shifted from passive documentation to active preparation. I drove to my bank and retrieved the original, hard copies of my deed and title insurance policy from my safe deposit box. I hired a professional surveyor, the best in the county, to come out and formally mark my property lines with bright orange stakes and wooden markers. It cost me $2,000. I kept the receipt. The survey confirmed what I already knew. The path was entirely on my land. I then drafted a formal letter. It was polite, professional, and unequivocal. It stated that I was the legal owner of Parcel A, that no public or community easement existed to cross my property, as described in her notice, and that any attempt by the HOA or its contractors to enter my land for the purposes of clearing or construction would be considered trespassing. I included a copy of my deed and a scaled-down version of the new survey plat, with my property lines clearly highlighted. I sent it via certified mail, with return receipt requested. It required a signature for delivery. A week later it came back to me. The envelope was unopened. Scrawled across the front in thick, black marker was "Return to Sender," not an HOA member. This was a critical mistake on her part. By refusing delivery, she had legally waived her right to claim she was not informed. Her arrogance was becoming my greatest asset. 3 weeks after that, I woke up to the sound of the excavator. Which brings me back to that morning, standing in my dew-soaked slippers, my empty coffee mug in my hand. Carol stood there, radiating smug satisfaction, waiting for me to argue, to yell, to give her the confrontation she craved. She wanted a scene. She wanted to perform her role as the righteous enforcer of order against the unreasonable outsider. I simply turned and walked back to my house. I could feel her eyes on my back, her confusion mounting. "That's it?" she yelled after me. "You have nothing to say. We're taking back our land." I went inside, set my mug in the sink, and walked to my office. The manila folder was on my desk. It was now nearly 3 inches thick. I took out the video camera I used for bird watching, a model with a powerful zoom lens, and set it up on a tripod in my office window. It had a perfect, unobstructed view of the worksite. I hit record. Then I sat down at my desk, picked up the phone, and called the county sheriff's non-emergency line. "Yes," I said calmly to the dispatcher. "I'd like to report a case of trespassing and destruction of property. My name is Arthur Vance. My address is 1100 Reservoir Road. There is a construction vehicle on my land, and they are refusing to leave." I gave her the details, including the name of the excavator company, which was printed clearly on the machine's side. My next call was to David. David had been my paralegal for the last 15 years of my career. He was younger than me, sharper with technology, and had the hungry, meticulous mind of a bloodhound. When I retired, he started his own legal consulting firm. We'd kept in touch. "David," I said when he answered. "It's Arthur. It started." "The HOA president?" he asked. There was a note of anticipation in his voice. I had given him a preliminary briefing weeks ago. "She has an excavator on my lawn," I said. "I have it on video. The sheriff is on the way, but I think it's time to move on to the main event. I need you to start the title search on the water rights." "I was hoping you'd say that," David said. "I've already pulled the preliminary documents. The original developer, a company called Mountain View Estates, LLC, was dissolved in 2008. The handshake deal they had with the farmer was never formalized. The HOA's governing documents make a single, vague reference to a private water system, but they don't specify the source or the legal basis for its use. They've been operating unborrowed time for 15 years, and they don't even know it. I want you to find the original water license agreement," I said. "There has to be one, even if it was just a draft. The developer's lawyers would have insisted on it, even if the farmer was old school. Check the defunct corporation's archived records. Check the county water board archives. Find the piece of paper that proves they know their water comes from Parcel A." "I'm on it," he said. "What are you going to do now?" I looked out the window. The excavator had paused. The operator was talking to Carol, likely telling her he wanted to wait for the authorities. "I'm going to go put on some real shoes," I said, "and then I'm going to go present a trespasser with a copy of my deed." I hung up, went to my bedroom, and got dressed. Not in a suit, but in sturdy work pants, a clean collared shirt, and my old leather boots. I felt a familiar calm settle over me. The chaos outside was just a problem to be solved. It had variables, rules, and a logical solution. This was my world. I went to my filing cabinet and pulled out a fresh, crisp copy of the survey plat and the full legal description of my property. I slipped them into a clear plastic sleeve to protect them from the dirt. Then I walked back outside. A sheriff's deputy was just pulling up. A young man, professional and cautious. His name tag read Miller. He got out of his car and surveyed the scene. The half-dug trench, the big yellow machine, Carol standing with her hands on her hips, and me walking calmly towards them with a document in my hand. "Ma'am, sir," he said, his voice neutral. I'm Deputy Miller. I got a call about a property dispute. Before I could speak, Carol launched into her performance. Oh, thank goodness you're here, officer, she gushed, her voice dripping with manufactured relief. This man, she said, pointing at me, has been a nightmare. He's trying to block off a vital community access path that has been used for 20 years. We're simply trying to restore it, and he's called you to harass us with false claims. Deputy Miller turned to me. Sir, is this your property? Yes, it is, I said quietly. I handed him the plastic sleeve. This is a copy of the official survey plat, completed and filed with the county 3 weeks ago. My name is Arthur Vance, the owner of this parcel. As you can see, the property line is approximately 50 yards downslope from this trench. This woman has hired a contractor to illegally excavate on my land. Miller took the document and studied it for a long moment. He was trained to read these things. He could see the surveyor's seal, the legal description, the lot, and block numbers. He walked over to the single remaining survey stake that the excavator hadn't reached yet, its orange flag fluttering in the breeze. He looked at the stake, then back at the plat map in his hand. He could see it lined up perfectly. He turned to Carol. His tone was still professional, but a hard edge had crept into it. Ma'am, do you have any documentation that shows this land is part of your HOA's common area? Of course, she said, fumbling with her clipboard. She produced her photocopy of the marketing brochure. It had a little cartoon map of whispering pines, with a dotted line leading up the hill labeled Nature Trail. Miller glanced at it. Ma'am, this is a sales map. It's not a legal plat. Do you have a deed or an easement filed with the county recorder's office? It's on the original plans, she insisted, her voice rising. This has been understood for 20 years. He's the one who's new here. He can't just change the rules. The rules are written on the deeds, ma'am, Miller said flatly. He handed the plat back to me. Sir, based on the document you've provided, it appears you are correct. This is your property. He then turned to the excavator operator. Son, what's your name? The operator, a young man who looked like he wished he were anywhere else, mumbled his name. Well, Miller said, right now, you are operating your vehicle on private property against the owner's wishes. I'm not going to cite you for it right now, because it seems you were acting under her direction. But I'm advising you to shut down your machine and remove it from this gentleman's property immediately. The operator didn't hesitate. He climbed into the cab, started the engine, and began backing the excavator out of the trench and onto the road below. Carol was incandescent with rage. You can't do this. This is HOA business. This is a civil matter. You have no jurisdiction. Ma'am, Miller said, his patience clearly wearing thin. Right now, what I have is a property owner with a filed survey map, and you with a marketing brochure. Trespassing and destruction of property are not civil matters when they're in progress. This is a criminal complaint. Now I am ordering you to leave this property. Now if you set foot on it again, Mr. Vance can have you charged. He turned to me. Sir, do you want to press charges for the damage already done? This was a key moment. A criminal charge would be satisfying, but it was a messy, unpredictable route. A documented police report, on the other hand, was a perfect piece of evidence. Not at this time, Deputy, I said. For now, I would just like a formal record of the event. I want it noted in your report that I presented you with a valid survey plat, that you identified the land as my private property, that you ordered Ms. Jennings and her contractor to leave, and that she claimed to be acting with the authority of the Whispering Pines HOA. And please note the name of the excavation company. I also asked him to document my request for him to turn on his body camera for the entire interaction, which he confirmed he had done. I was building my case, piece by piece, on paper. Miller nodded, taking notes in his pad. Understood, Mr. Vance. He handed Carol a card with a case number on it. This is now a documented incident. Do not come back onto this property. Am I clear? She snatched the card from his hand, shot me a look of pure venom, and stalked off down the hill without another word. The mask was gone. All that was left was the snarling face of a petty tyrant who had been publicly contradicted. She had no idea that this was just the overture. The real concert was about to begin. I thanked Deputy Miller. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You seem to have your ducks in a row, sir," he said quietly, before getting back in his car and driving away. I stood there for a moment, looking at the ugly wound in my lawn. The quiet had returned. The only sounds were the birds and the distant hum of traffic. I went back inside, to my office window. My video camera was still recording. I had captured the entire exchange with the deputy. Another piece for the folder. I sat down at my desk and pulled a legal pad towards me. At the top, I wrote, Phase 2. The water. The confrontation with the deputy had been a tactical victory, but it was just one battle in a larger war. Carol was not the type to retreat. She would double down. She would use the full apparatus of the HOA to punish me. Fines, lawyers, endless harassment. Her power came from the collective will of the 150 homeowners below me. To truly solve the problem, I had to dismantle the foundation of that power. I had to show the residents of Whispering Pines that their queen had no clothes, and more importantly, no water. David called me back that afternoon. "Bingo," he said. "It was buried deep in the county planning archives, misfiled under the developer's parent corporation, a draft document from 2003. It's a temporary water system license and easement agreement. It was between Mountain View Estates, LLC, and the old farmer, Silas Black." "What does it say?" I asked, my pen poised over my legal pad. "It's even better than we hoped," David said, a lawyer's excitement in his voice. "It grants the developer a license to draw up to 200,000 gallons per day from the reservoir on Parcel A for the exclusive use of the Whispering Pines development. It specifies the location for the pump house and the underground pipes. But here are the beautiful parts. 1. It was a 20-year term. It expired 6 months ago. 2. It was a license, not a permanent right. It was personal to the developer. It specifically states that the license is non-transferable and does not run with the land. When Mountain View Estates, LLC dissolved, the license technically became void. 3. It contains a termination clause. The licensor, that's you now, can terminate the agreement with 30 days written notice for any breach of its terms. And Silas Black, bless his cantankerous old heart, included a very specific term. I waited. The agreement is contingent on the quiet enjoyment of the licensor's property, Parcel A. Any nuisance, harassment, or trespass by the licensee or its successors in interest is grounds for immediate termination. I leaned back in my chair. It was perfect. It was a masterpiece of simple, rural justice, written into a legal document 2 decades ago. The old farmer had, from beyond the grave, handed me the exact tool I needed. Carol's excavator hadn't just dug a wench in my lawn. It had dug a grave for her community's water supply. "She had no idea," I murmured. "She had no idea," David agreed. "So what's the play? Do we send the termination notice now?" "No," I said, thinking strategically. "Not yet. That's the knockout punch. First, we need to solidify our position. I want to put her on the defensive. I'm going to repair my lawn and send the HOA a bill, a professionally prepared itemized bill. I hired a landscaping company that specialized in turf restoration. They came the next day, filled the trench with topsoil, and laid down new, expensive sod. The total cost was $4,723. I paid them, and I kept the receipt. I then drafted an invoice to the Whispering Pines HOA, care of Carol Jennings. I included a copy of the landscaper's bill and a cover letter citing the police report number and stating that if the invoice was not paid, within 30 days, I would be filing a claim in small claims court. I sent it via registered mail. This wasn't about the money. It was about creating another official record of their liability. It was another piece of paper for the folder. As expected, Carol's response was not a check. It was a full-scale assault. 2 days later, a special newsletter was distributed to every home in Whispering Pines. I got a copy from a source I was beginning to cultivate. The newsletter, written by Carol, painted a dramatic picture of an aggressive, uncooperative landowner who was trying to extort the community. It claimed I was illegally denying access to a beloved nature trail and had maliciously involved the police in a simple property matter. It announced that a special assessment was being levied on every homeowner to create a legal defense fund to fight my frivolous claims. And it announced a special HOA meeting to discuss further action. This was good. She was putting her narrative in writing. She was creating evidence against herself. But she was also poisoning the well, turning the entire community against me before they even knew the real stakes. I needed allies. My first ally came to me, ironically, because of his lawn. Mr. Henderson, the man Carol had mistaken me for, lived in a small house near the entrance to the development. He was a retired accountant in his late 70s, and his pride and joy was his immaculate garden of prize-winning roses. He approached me one evening as I was getting my mail. He was holding a copy of Carol's newsletter and looked deeply troubled. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice a frail whisper, "I read this. It's not right what she's saying. It's not right what she's doing." "I agree, Mr. Henderson," I said. "She's been after me for years," he continued, his hands trembling slightly. "My water usage for the roses, the color of my trim, silly things. But this is different. She's lying to everyone. That was never a community path. That was just the way old Silas used to get his tractor down the hill." "You knew Silas Black?" I asked. "Oh, yes. I was one of the first to buy a house here. I remember when the developers were negotiating with him. He was a tough old bird. He didn't trust them one bit. He told me once, 'I'll let them have their water, but I'm keeping the spigot. One day they'll get greedy and someone will need to turn it off.'" Mr. Henderson's eyes widened as the implication of his own words hit him. He looked up the hill towards the reservoir. "Dear me," he whispered. "Mr. Henderson," I said gently, "do you remember anything else about those early days? Any meetings? Any documents?" He thought for a moment. "The early board meetings. Before Carol took over. We were more informal then. I was the secretary for a year. I kept notes." He shuffled his feet. "They're just handwritten notes, probably in a box in my attic." "Those notes could be very important," I said. "They could show that the early board knew the water arrangement was temporary." A flicker of resolve appeared in his eyes. He was a man who had been pushed around for too long. "I'll look for them," he said, his voice firmer now. It's time someone stood up to her. He was my fearful ally, the conscience of the community. 2 days later, a shoebox appeared on my porch. Inside were several spiral notebooks, filled with neat, precise accountant's handwriting. It was Mr. Henderson's notes from the HOA meetings from 2004 to 2006. I spent an entire day reading them. And there it was, an entry from March 17, 2005. Discussion water agreement. Board member T. Gable raises concern about 20-year term limit on reservoir license. President notes, developer assured it would be resolved long before expiration. Motion to table further discussion passes. It was the smoking gun. It proved the HOA board had known about the ticking clock from the very beginning. They had known and had chosen to kick the can down the road. I scanned the page and emailed it to David with the subject line, Exhibit C. My next ally came from inside the enemy camp. I received an anonymous email from an encrypted address. "I am a member of the HOA board," it read. "I am tired of Carol's bullying and financial recklessness. She has not shared your letters or the police report with the full board. We are being told you are an extortionist. I believe there is more to this story. I am the treasurer. If you can provide me with proof of your position, I may be able to help." This was the disillusioned insider. I had David verify the source as best he could. It seemed legitimate. I replied with a single attachment, a PDF of the survey plat. The response came an hour later. "I had no idea. This is not what she told us. The legal defense fund money is already being spent. She's retained a high-priced law firm from the city. I am attaching the HOA's financials for the past 5 years. You will note there is no capital reserve fund for infrastructure, and specifically no provision for acquiring water rights or connecting to the municipal grid. She has run this place into the ground. Please tell me you have a plan. I downloaded the financials. They were exactly as the treasurer, I would later learn her name was Brenda, had described. The HOA was running on a shoestring, with all its surplus funds going to beautification projects like new signs and petunia beds, and to Carol's chosen law firm. They were financially exposed and completely dependent on the water flowing from my reservoir. I emailed Brenda back. I have a plan. The special meeting is in 1 week. Be prepared. With my allies in place and my documentation assembled, it was time for the final piece of preparation. Carol's last, desperate escalation. It came in the form of a man with a clipboard knocking on my door 2 days before the meeting. He was a process server. He handed me a thick envelope. Inside was a temporary restraining order. Carol, in her capacity as HOA president, had filed for an injunction against me, claiming I was a threat to the community. The order, granted ex parte, meaning I wasn't present to defend myself, forbade me from coming within 500 feet of any HOA common area, and, as most ridiculously, from interfering in any way with the water supply of the Whispering Pines development. I laughed out loud. It was a magnificent act of self-sabotage. In a court filing, under penalty of perjury, she had just officially linked me to the water supply. She had unwittingly entered the central fact of my case into the public record. She had no idea she had just handed me the key to the entire kingdom. I immediately called David. She got a TRO, I said, still chuckling. She what? David was incredulous. On what grounds? Harassment, threats, and, get this, potential interference with the water supply. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line, then a low whistle. Oh, she is going to regret that. The judge who signed this will be furious when he finds out she omitted the fact that you own the water source. This moves from a civil harassment case to perjury and fraud on the court. Arthur, this is no longer just about an HOA dispute. This has criminal implications for her. I know, I said. Scan it and add it to the presentation. It's the grand finale. The night of the special meeting, the clubhouse was packed. The air was thick with anger and anxiety. Carol had whipped the residents into a frenzy. I was the villain, the greedy outsider trying to hold their community hostage. I saw Mr. Henderson sitting in the back, looking nervous but determined. I saw Brenda at the board table, her face a neutral mask. I was not allowed inside the clubhouse due to the restraining order. This was part of Carol's plan. She would have the stage all to herself, but she had underestimated me. I had arranged for David to attend as my legal representative. He was a licensed attorney, and the TRO didn't apply to him. He had a laptop, a projector, and a thumb drive containing what we now called the folder. I sat in my car in the parking lot, just outside the 500-foot limit, with a live audio feed from David's phone. I could hear everything. The meeting began with Carol's performance. It was the role of a lifetime. Her voice trembled with emotion as she described my campaign of terror. She spoke of the historic nature trail, the aggressive confrontation with the poor excavator operator, and my extortionate demand for landscaping fees. This man, she declared, her voice rising to a crescendo, wants to destroy our way of life. He seeks to bully and intimidate us. But we, the residents of Whispering Pines, will not be bullied. We have hired the best legal counsel, and we will fight him on the beaches. We will fight him on the nature trails. We will never surrender our community. The room erupted in applause. I could hear the self-satisfied smile in her voice as she moved onto the main agenda item. And now, the board will vote on ratifying a special fine of $50,000 against Mr. Vance's property for damages to our community's legal fund, and for his continued flagrant disregard for our governing documents. This was David's cue. Point of order, Madam President. His calm, clear voice cut through the noise. Carol was flustered. Who are you? This is a homeowners meeting. I am David Chen, legal counsel for Arthur Vance, he said. Since your baseless restraining order prevents my client from speaking for himself, I am here to present his response to your allegations before you take this fraudulent vote. This is out of order, Carol sputtered. You have no standing here. On the contrary, David said, his voice hardening slightly. Attempting to levy a fine on a non-member based on false pretenses gives my client every right to be heard. Or would you prefer we save this presentation for the judge when we move, to have your TRO dissolved and file for sanctions against you for perjury? The room went silent. The word perjury hung in the air. Brenda, the treasurer, seized the moment. Madam President, she said, her voice steady, I believe we should hear him out. We need to have all the information before we vote. Another board member, a man who had clearly grown weary of Carol's antics, nodded in agreement. I agree, let him speak. Carol was cornered. She had lost control of her own board. Fine, she hissed. You have 5 minutes. I'll only need 4, David said. He connected his laptop to the projector. The first image that flashed on the screen was the high-resolution survey plat. This, David began, is the legally filed survey of Mr. Vance's property. As you can see, the area you call the nature trail is located entirely within his private land. There is no easement. Exhibit A, your HOA, committed trespass. He clicked to the next slide. It was a still from my video of Deputy Miller talking to Carol, with a transcript of their conversation at the bottom. This is a record of the sheriff's deputy informing your president that she was on private property. Your president ignored this warning. Exhibit B, the HOA knowingly engaged in criminal activity. He clicked again. A picture of my invoice for the landscaping, stamped paid, next to a copy of the registered mail receipt showing the HOA had received it. This is the bill for repairing the damage your HOA caused. A bill you have ignored. Instead, you levied a legal defense fund assessment on your members. You created the liability, and you are asking your neighbors to pay for it. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People were starting to shift in their seats, looking at Carol not with admiration, but with confusion and dawning suspicion. But this isn't about a path or a few $1,000s in sod, David continued, his voice dropping. This is about something much more important. The next slide was a scan of the handwritten page from Mr. Henderson's notebook. The entry from March 17, 2005, was circled in red. This is from your own HOA archives. Notes from a board meeting 16 years ago, proving that your board knew from the very beginning that your water supply was based on a temporary license with a 20-year expiration date. The murmuring grew louder. Someone in the crowd shouted, "What is he talking about?" "He's talking about the reservoir," David said, clicking to the next slide. It was a map of the entire area, showing Parcel A and the Whispering Pines development. A thick blue line ran from the reservoir on my client's property down to the pump house that fed every home in the valley. For 20 years, your community has been drinking water that didn't belong to you. You were operating under a temporary license granted to the original developer. That license expired 6 months ago. Legally, your right to that water ceased to exist at that time. Now, the room was in an uproar. People were on their feet, shouting questions at the board table. Carol was pale, her face a mask of disbelief. "He's lying!" she shrieked. "Our water comes from the county." "Does it, Madam President?" David said, clicking to the final devastating slide. It was a copy of the temporary restraining order she had filed against me. He had highlighted one line in bright yellow, to prevent Arthur Vance from interfering in any way with the water supply of the Whispering Pines development. "This is the sworn statement you filed in court 2 days ago," David said, his voice ringing with cold finality. "Under penalty of perjury, you yourself linked Mr. Vance to your water supply. You knew. You have always known. You have risked the single most vital resource of this entire community in a petty squabble over a path that wasn't yours. You have lied to your neighbors. You have exposed them to massive legal and financial liability. and you did it all to protect your own ego." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Mr. Vance is not your enemy. He is the man who holds the deed to your water. The fine you are about to vote on is not just baseless. It is a declaration of war against the person who controls every faucet in this valley. I urge you to consider your next move very, very carefully." David turned off the projector. The room was utterly silent. You could have heard a pin drop. All eyes were on Carol. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The bravado, the confidence, the righteous indignation, it had all vanished. In its place was the blank, hollow-eyed expression of someone who has just watched their entire world crumble to dust. The mask didn't just drop. It shattered. She stared at the blank screen, then at the faces of her neighbors who were now looking at her with expressions of betrayal and fury. She had no idea. And now, finally, she did. In that moment of dead silence, Brenda, the treasurer, stood up. "I move to indefinitely table the vote on the proposed fine," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Furthermore, I move that we immediately retain independent counsel to assess the board's and the HOA's full legal exposure regarding the water license, and to open good faith negotiations with Mr. Vance. And finally, I move for a vote of no confidence in our current president, Carol Jennings." Mr. Henderson, from the back of the room, seconded the motion in a surprisingly loud voice. The spell was broken. The vote was called. It was a near-unanimous landslide. Carol sat, frozen, as her reign came to an ignominious end. The meeting descended into chaos as residents swarmed the board table, demanding answers. In the parking lot, I listened to it all, then turned off the audio feed. I started my car and drove home. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a deep, weary sense of vindication. The kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from a long, complex problem finally being solved. A blueprint perfectly executed. Order restored. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The HOA's new independent counsel met with David and me the following week. They were professional, apologetic, and horrified by what their review of the documents had uncovered. There was no negotiation, really. They accepted all our terms. First, the HOA paid my invoice for the landscaping damage in full. They also paid all of David's legal fees and the cost of the original survey. On paper, I was made whole. Second, all outstanding fines against my property were expunged from their records, and a formal, written apology was issued by the board on behalf of the entire HOA. The apology was also published in the next community newsletter. Third, Carol Jennings faced the consequences. The temporary restraining order was dissolved at an emergency hearing, where the judge excoriated her and her original lawyer for deliberately misleading the court. The HOA's new counsel reported her actions to the district attorney's office, which opened an investigation into perjury and potential wire fraud related to the Legal Defense Fund. She sold her house at a loss and moved away within 2 months. Her performative tyranny had left her with nothing. Fourth, and most importantly, we addressed the water. I had no desire to turn off their taps. That had never been my goal. My goal was peace, quiet, and the respect of my property lines. I was not a villain. I was an engineer. I saw a problem, and I wanted to build a stable, long-term solution. I offered the HOA a new, formal water license agreement. It was a 30-year lease with an option to renew. They would pay a modest annual fee for the right to draw water from my reservoir, a fee far, far lower than the cost of connecting to the municipal grid, which would have run into the millions. The agreement also contained strict clauses about trespassing and harassment. Any future violation by the HOA or its agents would result in steep financial penalties and the potential termination of the lease. It was a fair deal that provided them with water security, and me with a guarantee of peace. On paper, we were now partners, bound by a clear, enforceable contract. The community began to heal. Brenda was elected as the new HOA president. She was sensible, pragmatic, and transparent. The first thing she did with the new budget, now free from Carol's exorbitant legal fees, was to rescind a dozen of the most ridiculous aesthetic rules. The garden gnomes came out of hiding. People painted their mailboxes whatever color they wanted. The atmosphere in the valley below my house slowly changed from one of tense conformity to one of relaxed community. Mr. Henderson was even given a small plot of common land to start a community rose garden. The residents, once hostile strangers, now waved to me when I drove by. A few even stopped by to thank me. They understood now that I hadn't been the aggressor. I had been the enforcer of a reality they hadn't known existed. I had held up the blueprint and shown them the flaws in their foundation. A few weeks after the new agreement was signed, a small package arrived on my porch. It was from Brenda. Inside was a small, brass plaque. It read, "The Vance Reservoir, in appreciation for a partnership built on clarity and good faith." There was also a new, heavy-duty key, the key to the gate on the new fence that now properly secured the pump house on my property. It was a tangible symbol of the restored order. I sometimes sit on my back porch in the evenings, with a cup of decaf now, and look out over my land. The sod has taken root, and you can barely see the scar where the excavator dug. The surface of the reservoir is calm, reflecting the colors of the sunset. I think about ownership. It's not about fences or signs. It's not about yelling or posturing. It's a quiet, abstract thing. A network of rights and responsibilities written down on paper, filed away in county offices, upheld by process. It's an agreement between people, a shared belief in a logical order. Carol believed ownership came from desire and declaration. She learned it comes from deeds and documentation. Eleanor would have appreciated the quiet justice of it all. She always said that the most beautiful things were built on the strongest, most invisible foundations. A marriage, a painting, a community. My file is thinner now. The thick folder of complaints and threats has been replaced by a single, slender one containing the new water agreement. It's a quiet document, full of legal jargon and technical specifications. But to me it's a kind of poetry. It's the story of a problem solved, of chaos turned into order. It's the receipt for peace and quiet, and I always keep the receipts.